So let's take a look at some of the issues that could be faced if we don't do workforce planning. I've mentioned before in one of the modules that aging workforce is one of the key worries that we have as businesses, because that means that we have the risk of losing vital knowledge within our organisation. Now here's another one that doesn't get mentioned very often, but according to Clements, there is actually a theory and research that suggests that for every job within one particular industry, 4 jobs are created in another industry or in an allied industry. Now, to give you an example of what I mean by this, for instance, in the mining industry, if a plant operator is sent out to a mine site, that plant operator or group of plant operators will also need to employ cleaners to take care of the accommodation. They'll also need to employ chefs to cook and prepare the food for all of the workers on site. They may also need administrators to run and manage the actual site operations. You're going to need infrastructure. So you can see here how even in the smallest businesses, if we're not workforce planning effectively and we're not having the right staff in the right place and we're losing staff as a result, then we actually affect the entire economy. Every single job role within our business, no matter how small or large our company is, does impact the economy. So we need to be thinking on this much bigger scale when it comes to developing our workforce. One of the tendencies is to think is that when we're providing training is, well, what if we train them and they leave? Well, there's this old adage that says, well, what if we don't train them and they stay? Even worse than that is, what if nobody in our industry trains anybody? And our industry is then left with a major skills shortage, which is already being faced significantly in lots and lots of countries across the world. We need to be making sure that we are all taking responsibility as small and large organisations to ensure that we have a constant pool of skilled, experienced and qualified people in our workforce, because they do move around, they are all going to be within our industry, and they're helping the whole economy maintain strength and resilience. So let's take a look at this chart up here. This is just one example of one of the many pieces of data that we can analyse to inform our workforce planning process. Now this here is an example of how we can use age to assess our business's strengths, weaknesses and threats, and how we can identify what kind of workforce planning and development initiatives need to take place. Now you can see here that we have in this pretend business, we have a large percentage, I'd say probably nearly 50% of our organisation here are actually over the age of 50 and very close to approaching a retirement age. So this tells us immediately that we need to implement a succession plan, that we need to find a way of making sure that these most experienced people do not leave with all of the knowledge in our organisation. What it also suggests to us is that we need to make sure that when they're gone, they can be replaced by other people. So we need to look at our existing workforce, those earlier age gaps down the line here, to see how can we move those people up. How can we upskill those people, or do they need to be upskilled? Are they perfectly adequately skilled already to take over those positions? Can we look at some of the other roles within this organisation and, for instance, move our tradies up to an engineer position by putting them on some kind of apprenticeship scheme or traineeship scheme now, so that when the older guys do leave, the younger ones are qualified and trained and in a position to fill those gaps within the business? Perhaps it will tell us that we just simply need to go on a recruitment drive and find the qualified people as they are needed. So see, there is not necessarily one particular approach to filling the skills gaps, but there are certainly many different ways that we can source information and analyse data to see where and how we need to be addressing the workforce issues within our particular organisation. Other workforce issues include the fact that the best staff are sometimes hard to find, and importantly, they're also quite hard to keep. So we need to be using our workforce planning to not only attract them to become an employer of choice, but we also need to be making sure that they feel like they have a place within the business for the long-term future, so that we don't lose them and they do stay. There's also a very significant difference between labour shortages, labour needs, and skills shortages. Now, what we mean by these two words is by labour, we mean unqualified staff. That means people who do jobs that do not require licences, they don't require qualifications. Obviously, highly important individuals within our organisation. They perform absolutely essential tasks and essential work. But they are people that perhaps are easier to find, easier to source, and cheaper to pay because of the fact that there is a larger proportion of them out there. Now, globally, we don't have a labour shortage. Globally, it's quite easy to find these employees and these personnel, and therefore turnover can be fairly high in this space without it necessarily causing major impacts or major negatives on our bottom line. However, we then have the skills side, and what we mean by skills are those qualified positions. Those positions where we are looking for people that perhaps have more than 5 years experience, people who have a qualification of some level that's nationally or internationally recognised, or some kind of licence or ticket to actually be able to do their particular work. It means that these people are tougher to find, not only because positions of these nature require a long-term study. It also means these people are more expensive, and it often means that perhaps they are already employed elsewhere. These people are harder to find, and in a lot of countries we are suffering from a huge skills shortage, and we need to, as our different industries, make sure that we are filling the pool now. We may right now not have a need, for instance, for highly qualified people within our business, but in 2, 3, 4, 5 years' time, we may do. So that means we actually need to start training these people now, because those people that require degrees are going to take anything from 3 to 7 years in order to attain them. They're going to actually need to have some kind of work experience whilst doing that. So if we're not providing opportunities and we're not taking our responsibility to take on those apprenticeships, take on those internships, offer those opportunities for people to study, learn and grow, then we are doing ourselves a disservice, let alone the industry and the economy as a whole. If we are providing training not only for our labour type skills workforce but also for our skilled workforce, then we are closing that skills gap that the world is facing at the moment. Another issue that's faced by many businesses in many industries is that a lot of work that's being done, particularly in the current global financial economy we find ourselves in, is that a lot of work is based on project type scenarios, meaning that we are having to reduce our costs and our overheads in terms of staff, and that all the jobs we are employing people for tend to be on a short-term, fixed-term basis, depending on the length or duration of that particular project. Now, what that also means is that because projects naturally have different phases to them, we have the initiation, we have the implementation, we have the delivery, we have the shutdown and maintenance phases. They all require very, very different types of personnel. They require very different types of skills at each of those different phases, and therefore require extremely advanced workforce planning before the project even commences. Because on a project base, if we get our workforce planning wrong, if we're acting reactively instead of proactively, that can have serious effects on our deliverables of our project. It can also have serious effects on our budgets and our productivity as well. So workforce planning in this environment is not only vital for making sure we have the right people for each of those phases, it also means that we need to be making sure that we have the right contracts in place and the right budgets and the right resources so that we can have those people coming in at exactly the right times so that we're not risking our project milestones. Another major issue that we have with workforce planning across different types of business sectors across the world is that our training and implementation tends to happen very reactively. It tends to be that we put on training projects, or we recruit new staff, or we hire the wrong staff when we have to, on an as-needs basis, when a problem arises. We constantly seem to be putting out fires and reacting to the problems we have now when they hit us in the face. This is not an effective way to run business. In fact, this is a highly expensive and inefficient way to run business. It increases our costs and our overheads and our downtime of our staff. And if we can start being much more proactive, we're going to be saving ourselves a whole heap of drama in the future. So we need to move from reactivity to proactivity, and that simply comes about by implementing a workforce plan and knowing when and where we're going to hire people, how many people we need. It could be that we have a surplus of staff. So this is where we need to make sure that we change our current approach to delivering and fixing when we need to making sure that we're working on a preventative approach of not ever having those issues in the first place by having the foresight to pre-plan. Because essentially, if we don't have the right staff, our whole business suffers. And that's why we need to make sure that we do not restrict this issue just to our HR and our training departments. This is about the entire business from the top down and from the bottom up. So here is another example of how we can assess the kind of level of workforce that we are going to have or the problems that we may face. And this is simply called a workforce projection summary. And all this simply involves is looking at our current and projected projects and growth strategy. So where is it our business is growing? Are we opening new offices? Are we tendering for new contracts? Are we opening new sites? Or are we going to actually try and reduce our overheads and start minimizing our staff and multi-skilling them so we can have less staff doing more things? Whatever it may be, you need to essentially be looking at where are you now and how many staff will you need in the future, at least 5 years in advance, so that you can start preparing for that, so you can see if you could use even some of your internal staff to fill those gaps. Because if you've got a plan of where you are compared to where it is that you want to actually go, the gap in the middle is essentially the size of your problem. So we need to be planning this well in advance. And this is the problem of what happens in a lot of larger organizations in particular, is that this business planning, this growth planning is done at a much higher executive level and actually often isn't passed down to those HR and training departments or your middle management departments, who are the ones that are actually executing the decisions that are going to make sure this does or does not happen. So what happens is they find themselves suddenly with a new contract or with a new project, and they didn't have time to plan or prepare for that, and again they're back in reactive mode. Whereas if they have been notified 2, 3, 4, even 5 years in advance that these growth plans or these reduction plans are due to take place, then we would actually be minimizing a significant degree of the workforce issues and problems that we face within our organization. Granted, there are a lot of things we cannot plan for. We cannot plan for changes in contracts and changes in legislation. We cannot predict whether or not we will get a particular tender or contract. We also cannot predict things like the economic crisis, when it will start, when it will end, and what other changes might happen in interest rates, and you name it, the list is endless. But what we can certainly do is mitigate our risk as much as possible by preparing in advance at least what we do intend to do, the things we can control. And believe me, it makes a huge difference to your bottom line.